The Assumption, April 14th, 2024, 2:17 a.m., somewhere over the eastern Mediterranean. A radar screen pulses in soft green light. A blip appears, then another, then dozens. Inside an air operations center, no one speaks at first. Controllers lean closer to their screens, headphones pressed tight, fingers hovering, but not moving. This is not an exercise, not a drill, not a warning shot. These tracks are real, moving fast, converging along routes that, until this moment, had always been theoretical. You can almost feel the air tighten. For most of the post-World War II era, American analysts treated the region as dangerous but predictable. Chaotic on the surface, yes, but governed underneath by unspoken rules. Red lines existed. They were invisible, but everyone knew where they were. Cross one, and retaliation followed. Step back, and the fire cooled. It was a belief born not in the desert, but in the ashes of Europe. In the 1940s, American strategists learned their hardest lessons the brutal way. They watched deterrence fail in the 1930s as warnings were ignored, treaties broken, and incremental aggression rewarded. After 1945, they swore never to repeat it. Power had to be clear, consequences had to be credible, ambiguity was dangerous.
And for a long time, it worked. In the Middle East, American power loomed large. Carrier strike groups rotated through the region like floating fortresses. Air bases dotted friendly territory. Intelligence networks listened, watched, mapped every militia, every general, every launch site. The message was implicit but unmistakable. Escalation would be punished. By the 1990s and early 2000s, war games at the Pentagon often ended the same way. Regional actors pushed. The United States responded. Lines were redrawn, then respected. The system bent, but did not break. Even rivals accepted the rules. Until they didn't. The change didn't come with a single explosion. It arrived quietly, almost politely, disguised as restraint. Analysts noticed it first in the language. Official statements grew cautious. Retaliation became measured. Responses were proportional. Strikes were calibrated not for shock, but for signaling. This was supposed to strengthen deterrence, avoid spirals, keep control. But history has a way of punishing neat theories. In World War II, German commanders once believed Britain lacked the will to respond decisively after early provocations. Each unchallenged step emboldened the next. The Allies learned, painfully, that restraint without clarity invited miscalculation. Now, across briefing rooms and secure calls, a similar unease crept in. What if red lines weren't clear anymore? What if they were moving? Or worse, what if they had vanished altogether? In the Middle East, the battles no longer looked like wars. There were no formal declarations, no mass mobilizations. Instead, there were drones launched from anonymous deserts, rockets fired by groups that denied being states, cyber attacks with no fingerprints, strikes that could be disowned within minutes. Plausible deniability became the new battlefield. For American planners raised on Cold War logic, where escalation ladders were rigid and actors identifiable, this was deeply unsettling. Deterrence depended on knowing who to punish and how much pain would stop them. But what happens when the attacker shrugs and says, "It wasn't us"? The old playbook didn't account for this, and slowly, adversaries realized it. They tested the boundaries, a drone here, a rocket there, each incident carefully measured just below the threshold that would trigger a decisive response. Each one logged, debated, restrained. From their perspective, the lesson was clear. The lines were negotiable. By the early 2020s, the rhythm had changed. Attacks no longer waited for moments of high tension. They arrived during diplomatic talks, during holidays, during elections. Timing was no longer cautious, it was opportunistic. American intelligence assessments began to include an uncomfortable phrase: deterrence erosion. Not failure, not collapse, erosion, grain by grain. And erosion is dangerous because it doesn't feel urgent until the structure suddenly gives way. Back in the operations center, the blips keep multiplying. Some are slow, some fast, some high, some skimming the surface of the sea. Different profiles, different launch points, coordinated but deliberately messy. This is not a message. This is a demonstration. Officers exchange glances. They know what this means, even if no one says it aloud. Someone, somewhere, has decided the rules no longer apply. The red lines weren't crossed, they were ignored. And in that moment, as interceptors scramble and phones light up across capitals, a realization settles in. Heavy, undeniable. Deterrence was never permanent. It only lasted as long as everyone believed in it. And tonight, belief is gone. The unwritten rules. The first intercept happens far from any city. A flash on the horizon, a clean kill. Debris spirals into the dark water below. Inside the command center, no one cheers. This isn't victory, it's triage. Because everyone in the room understands the real question is not, can we stop this? It's, why is this happening at all? For generations, American strategists believed conflict in the Middle East followed a set of unwritten rules. Not laws, not treaties. Rules absorbed through repetition, enforced through memory and fear. You strike, but not too hard. You signal, but don't humiliate. You retaliate, but leave room to step back. Those rules were learned the same way soldiers learned battlefield instincts, through scars. After World War II, America watched what happened when red lines were vague or unenforced. In Europe, deterrence failed because warnings were whispered instead of shouted. In the Middle East, Washington tried to ensure that never happened again. Carrier groups were not just weapons, they were sentences. Air bases were punctuation marks. Sanctions, strikes, deployments, all carefully calibrated language. For decades, the message was understood, until a new generation of decision-makers began asking a dangerous question. What if the Americans don't want to escalate anymore? The shift wasn't imagined, it was observable. In briefing after briefing, analysts noted a pattern. U.S. responses were becoming narrower, shorter, more precise. Each strike justified not as punishment, but as containment. This wasn't weakness, it was intention. Washington wanted to avoid large wars. Endless wars had burned public patience, political capital, and blood. Precision replaced shock. De-escalation replaced dominance. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it changed everything. Deterrence only works if the cost of crossing a line feels unbearable. But what if the response feels survivable? In World War II, German commanders learned this lesson too late. Early Allied responses to aggression were restrained, fragmented, cautious. Each limited response taught Berlin the same lesson. The risk was manageable. The Middle East was beginning to echo that logic. Across the region, planners in rival capitals studied American behavior with the same cold discipline once used to analyze tank production or sortie rates. They charted response times. They measured rhetoric against action. They watched what didn't happen. And what they saw was consistency, not in punishment, but in restraint. This wasn't lost on Iran's strategic planners, nor on the militias aligned with it, nor on the commanders tasked with pushing boundaries without triggering war. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use proxies, use ambiguity, use volume. Force the defender to spend more than the attacker. Missiles against drones, Patriots against rockets, million-dollar interceptors against machines assembled for a fraction of the cost. This wasn't about winning a battle, it was about changing the math. In World War II, the Allies learned that wars are not won by bravery alone, but by production, sustainability, and endurance. Whoever could replace losses faster would outlast the other. Now that logic had returned, only this time the battlefield was deterrence itself. Each intercepted drone cost money, each alert exhausted crews, each near miss tested patience, and each incident that failed to provoke overwhelming retaliation rewrote the rules just a little more. The red lines didn't disappear overnight, they faded. Back in the operations center, new data streams in. Some targets are decoys, some are real, some are designed to draw fire, others to slip through. It's layered, deliberate, studied. This isn't rage, it's rehearsal. And that realization is chilling, because rehearsals are meant for something bigger. American officers exchange brief, quiet assessments. They recognize the pattern because history has shown it before. In the late 1930s, probing attacks tested responses, airspace violations, limited strikes. Each unanswered move made the next easier. This is how norms collapse, not with declarations, but with silence.
Someone finally says it, barely above a whisper. They don't believe we'll escalate. No one contradicts him. The real danger now isn't the incoming weapons, it's the strategic signal they send. This attack is not meant to cause maximum damage, it's meant to prove a point, that the old rules no longer bind, that escalation thresholds are guesswork, that deterrence is no longer a wall, but a negotiation, and negotiations favor the side willing to risk more. As interceptors streak upward, as phones ring across capitals from Washington to Israel and beyond, one truth settles in. The United States is no longer being tested tactically, it's being tested psychologically. How much pressure before restraint breaks? How many lines before one is finally enforced? Because once deterrence becomes conditional, it stops being deterrence at all. And somewhere, far from the radar screens, planners are already adjusting their calculations for the next move, the one that won't be ambiguous. The first miscalculation. The phone rings before dawn in Washington. Not the ceremonial kind, not the kind cushioned by assistants and briefing books. This one is direct. On the other end of the line, voices are clipped, precise, stripped of politics, the language of people who know time matters more than tone. Something has changed. Not exploded, not collapsed, shifted. And shifts are often more dangerous than shocks. For years, American planners believed miscalculation was the greatest risk in the Middle East. Not intention, not ideology, a mistake, a misunderstanding, a strike that went too far by accident. What they are confronting now is something far worse: deliberate ambiguity. In World War II, miscalculation often came from ignorance, poor intelligence, faulty assumptions, commanders acting on outdated information. Here, ignorance is not the problem. Everyone sees everything. Satellites watch launch sites in real time. Signals intelligence captures conversations minutes after they happen. Analysts can reconstruct an attack before the debris hits the ground. And yet, no one can agree on what it means. That uncertainty is paralyzing. Inside secure rooms, analysts begin replaying the timeline. The attack was large but not crippling, coordinated but restrained, provocative but deniable. Every element seems chosen to sit just below a threshold that no one can clearly define anymore. This is not escalation by accident. This is escalation by design. In the 1940s, German U-boat commanders learned how to operate in the gray zone, attacking just enough shipping to pressure Britain, but not enough to provoke overwhelming retaliation before they were ready. The logic is identical. Pressure without commitment, action without ownership, violence without accountability. The most dangerous moment in deterrence is not when both sides are angry, it's when both sides think they understand the other. American leaders assume adversaries want to avoid war, that escalation is something to be managed, delayed, prevented. But what if escalation is not the goal, but the tool? What if the objective is not war, but normalization of risk? Each attack that doesn't trigger decisive retaliation teaches a lesson, not to the public, not to politicians, to planners. It tells them how far they can go next time. The phrase appears in intelligence assessments with increasing frequency: strategic patience fatigue. It means the system is tired. Crews have been on alert too long. Resources are being drained slowly but constantly. Decision makers are forced to respond to every incident, no matter how small. This is not sustainable, and everyone knows it. In World War II, the Allies learned that constant defensive posture bleeds you dry. Britain nearly lost the Battle of the Atlantic, not because it lacked courage, but because the tempo favored the attacker. Now that lesson is echoing again. At the heart of the problem is a question no one wants to ask out loud. Who enforces the rules when the referee refuses to whistle? Deterrence requires credibility, not just capability. The belief that consequences will follow actions. But credibility erodes when responses feel optional, measured, conditional. Each time Washington pauses to weigh proportionality, adversaries are watching, not with fear, but with calculators. And calculators don't care about intentions. They care about patterns. The first miscalculation doesn't come from the attacker, it comes from the defender, from assuming the other side is playing the same game, from believing escalation is something both sides want to avoid equally. In the Middle East, that assumption is deadly, because for some actors, instability is not a risk, it's leverage. As the hours pass, the immediate crisis fades. The skies quiet, interceptors return to base, the public exhales. Headlines speak of restraint, officials praise calm, statements emphasize control. But beneath the surface, something has cracked. The attack didn't fail, it succeeded. Not militarily, but strategically. It demonstrated that red lines could be approached, touched, even leaned on, without snapping. And once that's proven, the next move becomes inevitable. In the late stages of World War II, Japanese commanders understood that they could no longer win conventionally, so they shifted strategy, not to defeat the United States outright, but to raise the cost of victory. Kamikaze attacks weren't about winning battles, they were about changing calculations. Now, a similar logic is emerging, without pilots, without declarations, without flags. Attrition of attention, attrition of patience, attrition of credibility. Back in Washington, one analyst circles a sentence in a report. If deterrence relies on shared assumptions, those assumptions no longer appear shared. It's an understatement, because what's really happening is this. The United States is still playing defense against escalation. Its adversaries have moved on to weaponizing uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't trigger alarms. It lingers. It accumulates. It waits. Somewhere, plans are being rewritten. Not for today, not for tomorrow, for the moment when ambiguity is no longer enough. Because when red lines vanish, they don't stay invisible forever. They get redrawn in blood.
When deterrence becomes a guess, the silence after the attack is deceptive. From the outside, it looks like calm. Markets open, flights resume. Official statements emphasize stability. The world moves on, reassured by the absence of flames on television screens. Inside planning rooms, no one relaxes, because the most dangerous phase has begun. the phase where deterrence turns into speculation. In classical deterrence theory, clarity is everything. You define a line, you communicate it, you enforce it. The enemy may hate it, test it, even curse it, but they understand it. What happens when that clarity dissolves? You get guessing. And guessing is lethal. In World War II, one of the most catastrophic failures came not from lack of strength, but from misunderstanding intent. Leaders assumed rivals would act rationally by their own standards. They mistook caution for weakness, delay for indecision. The result was disaster. Now, American planners are facing a modern version of that same trap. They know escalation is dangerous. They know overreaction can ignite war. They also know underreaction invites repetition. The problem is choosing which risk is greater. Every response option on the table carries consequences. A heavy strike might restore credibility, but trigger retaliation. A limited response might preserve calm, but signal tolerance. No response at all might buy time, but sell deterrence. There is no clean move anymore. That's the price of ambiguity. And ambiguity was never meant to last this long. Across the region, adversaries are watching closely, not for what the United States says, but for what it doesn't do. Silence becomes data. Delay becomes precedent. In World War II, German intelligence carefully tracked how Britain responded to each provocation in the late 1930s. Each muted reaction didn't reduce tension, it recalibrated ambition. The Middle East is undergoing the same recalibration, step by step. One planner summarizes it bluntly in a closed-door session. We're teaching them our pain threshold. That sentence hangs in the air, because thresholds, once identified, are meant to be crossed.
Deterrence used to be binary. You either triggered it or you didn't. Now it's a spectrum, and spectrums invite experimentation. How close can we get? How often can we push? How many proxies can we use? How much damage is acceptable before response? These are not emotional questions. They are logistical ones. And logistics favor the side that can operate cheaply, endlessly, and without attribution. In the Middle East, that advantage belongs to those who don't need to win decisively. They just need to keep the pressure on. A drone here, a rocket there, a cyber intrusion, a maritime incident, each one individually manageable, together exhausting. This is deterrence by erosion. And erosion doesn't look like war until suddenly it does. American commanders are haunted by a familiar historical echo. In the early days of the Pacific War, Japanese planners believed the United States lacked the will to fight a long conflict. They expected shock to paralyze decision-making. Instead, they triggered an industrial mobilization that crushed them. But today's challengers are not making that mistake. They're not seeking shock, they are avoiding it. They want to stay below the level that provokes total mobilization. They want to bleed, not break. And that's where the danger lies, because bleeding never feels urgent until you look down and realize how much you've lost. As weeks pass, intelligence reports begin to shift in tone. Words like isolated disappear. Phrases like pattern of behavior take their place. Threat assessments stop asking if something will happen and start asking when. This is the moment deterrence experts dread. The moment where everyone senses momentum, but no one controls it.
In World War II, momentum often decided outcomes before battles were even fought. Once Germany committed to a two-front war, defeat became a matter of time. Once Allied production reached critical mass, victory became inevitable. Momentum is invisible until it isn't. And in the Middle East, momentum is moving in the wrong direction. A senior officer puts it plainly, if we don't reset the rules, they'll keep rewriting them. Resetting rules means drawing lines again, clear ones,
public ones, lines that carry consequences. But drawing lines means being prepared to enforce them, every time, without hesitation, without qualifiers. And that is the decision Washington has been avoiding, not because it lacks power, but because it understands the cost. Here's the cruel paradox. Deterrence feels safest when it's strongest, but strongest when it's used. And once it's used, there's no pretending anymore, no ambiguity, no deniability, just action and reaction. As planners weigh options, one truth becomes unavoidable. The Middle East is no longer operating under inherited rules from the post-World War II order. It is writing a new playbook, one where escalation is gradual, where red lines are tested, not respected, where stability is not assumed, but exploited. And the longer the guessing continues, the more dangerous the answer will be when it finally arrives, because when deterrence becomes a guess, someone eventually guesses wrong.
The moment red lines die. Red lines don't disappear with explosions. They die quietly, in meeting rooms, in delayed decisions, in carefully worded statements that say everything except what matters. There is a moment in every collapsing system when people realize the rules no longer protect them, but continue acting as if they do. In World War II, French commanders clung to the Maginot Line, long after German armor had proven it irrelevant. The doctrine survived, even when reality had already moved past it. Deterrence in the Middle East is reaching that same moment, not because it failed once, but because it failed without consequence. Inside classified briefings, a new phrase begins circulating, spoken softly, never in public. Red line exhaustion. It means every warning has been issued before, every threat has already been implied, every consequence has been delayed, narrowed, or outsourced. When red lines are repeated without enforcement, they stop being barriers, they become background noise. And background noise invites risk. Across the region, adversarial planners notice something else. The responses are no longer shaping behavior, they are shaping expectations. The expectation is not that retaliation won't come, it's that retaliation will be limited, predictable, manageable. In deterrence terms, that is fatal. History is merciless on this point. In the late 1930s, each unchallenged provocation didn't reduce the likelihood of war, it refined the attacker's confidence. War became less frightening, not more. Now the same psychological shift is taking place, step by step, strike by strike, silence by silence. The red lines didn't vanish because someone crossed them. They vanished because no one stopped pretending they still existed. This realization hits hardest among mid-level planners, the ones who live inside the data, not the speeches. They see the trend lines. Frequency up, severity slowly up, response consistency down. That combination has only one historical outcome: escalation. Not because anyone wants it, but because the system no longer prevents it.
Deterrence is supposed to remove temptation. What it has done instead is create a ladder. Each rung climbed without punishment makes the next rung easier, and ladders don't stay halfway climbed forever. In World War II, Japanese planners underestimated American resolve at Pearl Harbor, but once the line was crossed, there was no ambiguity left. The response was total. The Middle East has not crossed its Pearl Harbor moment. That's the danger. Everything is still happening below the level that forces clarity, and clarity, once forced, is rarely gentle. A senior analyst puts it in writing for the first time. We are no longer deterring actions, we are managing their consequences. That sentence marks a turning point, because managing consequences means accepting the action already happened. Deterrence is supposed to stop the action before it begins. As pressure mounts, allies quietly ask questions no one wants to answer. What happens if the next attack is bigger? What if attribution is clearer? What if civilians are killed in large numbers? What response is guaranteed, not debated, not calibrated, not delayed? The silence in response is telling. In deterrence theory, uncertainty favors the attacker. They choose the timing, they choose the method, they choose the ambiguity. The defender reacts, always second, always late. The red lines didn't vanish in a single night. They were worn away. And now, standing at the edge of what used to be a boundary, American planners face the same realization commanders have faced throughout history. When rules collapse, power fills the vacuum. Not moral arguments, not intentions, not restraint. Power. The question is no longer whether deterrence can be restored. It's how, and more importantly, at what cost. Because restoring deterrence requires one thing the system has been avoiding since the beginning. A moment so unmistakable, so decisive that no one needs to guess where the line is ever again. And moments like that rarely stay contained. Somewhere, plans are being finalized. Not for signaling, not for warning, for enforcement. And when enforcement comes, it will arrive without ambiguity, without deniability, without room to step back. The red lines are gone. What replaces them will decide whether the next chapter is written in restraint or war.
The return of old lessons.
The problem with history is not that it repeats, it's that it waits.
In the early hours of another quiet morning, long after the radar screens have gone dark, planners begin reaching backwards, not forwards, for answers. They don't say it openly, but the shift is unmistakable. The assumptions that guided policy for decades are no longer holding. So they turn to the last time deterrence truly mattered, World War II. After 1945, American strategy was built on a hard-earned conclusion. Deterrence only works when it is unmistakable, not subtle, not nuanced, not endlessly debated. Unmistakable. During the Cold War, red lines were terrifying precisely because they were simple. Everyone knew what crossing them meant. That clarity kept catastrophe at bay, not goodwill, not trust, not restraint. But in the Middle East, clarity was traded for flexibility, and flexibility, over time, became fragility. Inside strategic assessments, parallels begin to surface. In the 1930s, leaders believed incremental concessions could preserve peace. Each compromise was meant to buy time. Each delay was justified as prudence. Instead, it taught aggressors something far more valuable, that the cost of action was negotiable. The Middle East is now living inside that same dangerous lesson. The question facing Washington is no longer theoretical, it's operational. Can deterrence be restored without escalation? History's answer is uncomfortable. Rarely. In World War II, deterrence didn't stop German expansion. It ended only when force was applied so decisively that no further testing was possible. The lesson is brutal but consistent. Deterrence doesn't survive ambiguity. It survives fear. This is where modern planners hesitate. Fear is not a word used lightly anymore. Neither is dominance. Neither is shock. Those concepts belong to an earlier era, one stained by massive wars and irreversible consequences. But adversaries are not bound by American discomfort. They are studying outcomes, not values, and outcomes show that restraint, when unreciprocated, becomes an invitation. A classified simulation runs late into the night. Scenario after scenario is tested. Limited retaliation, expanded retaliation, direct attribution, indirect signaling. Each path leads to a familiar fork.
Either deterrence is restored quickly, or escalation becomes inevitable later under worse conditions. There is no path where erosion simply stops on its own. History offers no example of that. In World War II, once the balance tipped, events accelerated beyond anyone's control. Leaders discovered too late that delaying confrontation didn't avoid war, it reshaped it into something far more destructive. That memory weighs heavily now, because the Middle East is not drifting toward calm, it is drifting toward a decision point. Across the region, Allied leaders begin asking harder questions, not if the United States will respond decisively, but when, and if not now, then under what circumstances. Those questions expose the core weakness. No one can answer them with confidence. Deterrence requires belief, belief requires precedent, and precedent requires action. Without it, power becomes theoretical, and theory doesn't stop missiles. In one internal memo, a planner writes a line that echoes uncomfortably across decades of military history. Delayed clarity multiplies future cost. It could have been written in 1938. It could have been written in 1941. Now, it's being written again. The United States still has overwhelming capability. So does Israel. So do their adversaries, including Iran through networks and proxies. This is not a question of strength. It's a question of resolve made visible. The old lessons are returning because they never stopped being true. Deterrence is not maintained by intention. It is not preserved by language. It is not sustained by hope. It is sustained by certainty. And certainty only comes when consequences are no longer theoretical. Somewhere between restraint and response, the post-World War II order is being tested again. This time, not by massed armies, but by patience, ambiguity, and time. And time, history warns, always favors the side willing to act first when the rules collapse. The decision point is approaching, not announced, not scheduled, not chosen. It will arrive because the system can no longer hold. And when it does, the past will offer no comfort, only reminders, because the world has seen what happens when red lines vanish, and what it costs to redraw them. The decision no one wants. Decision points don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with countdown clocks or formal declarations. They appear quietly, often disguised as routine meetings, updated briefings, revised rules of engagement. And then, suddenly, they're unavoidable. In a secure room far from any battlefield, senior officials stare at the same maps they've seen 100 times before. The icons are familiar, the threat vectors known, the capabilities understood. What has changed is not the map, it's the margin for error. That margin is gone. In First World War, Britain hesitated not because it was weak, but because it feared the cost of action. That fear was rational, the cost was real, and yet delay only ensured the eventual price would be higher. The same arithmetic is reappearing now. Inside the room, the conversation shifts from options to consequences. Not what happens if we act, but what happens if we don't. That inversion marks a psychological threshold. It means restraint is no longer preserving stability. It is undermining it. Military leaders are blunt. Every day we wait, one of them says, we normalize the next attack. Normalization is poison to deterrence, because once behavior feels normal, stopping it requires disruption, not management. And disruption is inherently risky. Civilian leaders hesitate, as they should. They understand the weight of precedent. They know that decisive action closes doors as much as it opens them. They know escalation is not a ladder you can always climb down. But they also know something else. History punishes indecision more reliably than boldness. World War II offers no example where deterrence was restored through patience alone. When deterrence failed, it was restored only after a moment so clear that no one could misread it. Berlin after Stalingrad, Tokyo after the firebombing, Germany after Normandy. Each moment carried an unmistakable message. The rules have changed. No one in the room wants to create that kind of moment, but everyone understands what happens if no one does. The system keeps drifting, the attacks keep coming, the thresholds keep moving, until one day the choice is made for them, by an adversary, by an accident, by a strike that finally goes too far.
This is the cruel trap of deterrence collapse. Act early and you risk escalation. Act late and you guarantee it. The only difference is timing and who controls it. A phrase appears on the whiteboard, written and underlined twice. Control the escalation. It sounds reassuring, but everyone in the room knows the truth. Once deterrence has failed, escalation is never fully controllable. It can be influenced, shaped, slowed, but not commanded. The meeting ends without a public decision. That too is a decision, one that will be read carefully by those watching from afar. Because silence is never neutral. It either signals restraint or confirms doubt. Outside, the world continues as if nothing is wrong. Inside the system, pressure keeps building, not explosively, relentlessly, like stress on a fault line. World War II did not begin with total war. It began with tests, with assumptions, with leaders believing they still had time. By the time certainty arrived, it was already too late to choose how. The Middle East is approaching its own moment of certainty, not because someone wants it, but because deterrence, once eroded, demands replacement. And replacement always comes in one of two forms: rules or force. The only remaining question is who will decide which comes first.
When the world learns the answer, the strike doesn't come when anyone expects it. That's the first lesson. It doesn't follow a provocation headline. It doesn't arrive on the heels of a speech. It doesn't wait for consensus. It comes when the calculus quietly tips. In the aftermath, analysts will argue about timing, about intent, about whether it was inevitable or avoidable. They will miss the point. The real story isn't what happened. It's why it could no longer be avoided. For years, deterrence in the Middle East survived on shared assumptions that escalation was undesirable, that boundaries mattered, that restraint would be reciprocated. Those assumptions died long before the strike. What remained was inertia, and inertia never stops history. It only delays it. World War II taught a lesson that modern strategists often soften with language, but never escape. When deterrence collapses, peace does not return gradually. It resets violently. The system demands clarity, and clarity is expensive. In the aftermath of the decision, the language changes. No more ambiguity, no more measured responses, no more signaling. Statements become blunt, targets are named, lines are drawn not in private memos, but in actions everyone can see. This is not escalation for its own sake. It is restoration of credibility, of certainty, of fear.
History is unkind, but consistent. Deterrence does not survive by being reasonable. It survives by being believed, and belief is forged not in speeches, but in consequences. In World War II, the moment belief returned was unmistakable. After Stalingrad, the myth of German invincibility died. After Midway, Japan knew the balance had shifted.
After Normandy, Europe understood the endgame had begun. Those moments didn't end the war immediately, but they ended uncertainty. That is what the modern decision seeks to do, not to solve the conflict, not to create peace, but to end guessing, to make the cost of action unmistakable again. Across the region, calculations change overnight, not because capabilities disappeared, but because assumptions did. What was once manageable is now unacceptable. What was once deniable is now dangerous. What was once tolerated is now punished. This is how deterrence returns, abruptly, unelegantly, at a price. Critics will argue it should have happened sooner. Others will argue it never should have happened at all. Both will be right. That is the tragedy of deterrence failure. There is no perfect moment, only moments that are less bad than the ones that follow. In the long view, this was never just about the Middle East. It was about the post-World War II system itself, a system built on the belief that power, clearly applied, could prevent catastrophe. That belief eroded, not because it was wrong, but because it was neglected. Future analysts will mark this period as a transition, the end of assumed stability, the return of enforced boundaries, the reminder that order does not maintain itself. It must be upheld. The lesson will be taught quietly in war colleges and briefing rooms. Deterrence is not moral, it is not fair, it is not gentle, but when it disappears, something far worse takes its place. Red lines vanished because no one believed they would be enforced. They returned the only way history ever allows, through action that leaves no room for interpretation. And somewhere, years from now, a new generation of planners will look back on this moment the way we look back on the 1930s or the early days of World War II, not as a failure of intelligence, but as a failure of belief. Belief that deterrence, once established, is permanent. It isn't. It must be renewed, again and again, at a cost.